Welcome to Perspectives on Prevention, the podcast series from the Prevention and Early Intervention Network. In this episode, I'm very pleased to speak with Benjamin Perks, the author of Trauma Proof. We'll be talking about population health approaches and global initiatives to tackle child health issues and how they apply at local level to child protection and children's well-being. Welcome to Perspectives on Prevention, the podcast series for the Prevention and Early Intervention Network, and I'm very pleased to be here today with Benjamin Perks, who has a long history of working with the UN on global issues relating to child development, child protection, population health, and Ben is also the author of Trauma Proof, which is Healing, Attachment and the Science of Prevention. Ben, you're very, very welcome.
Thank you, Mariam. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So, Ben, tell us about what you've learned over your couple of decades of working globally on child protection and child development. What are the kind of key lessons that you've been coming away with?
I think that child health, to start with that, has really had enormous achievements such as the dramatic reduction in child mortality, improvement in nutrition outcomes, and so on globally, because they've been able to focus on those areas that have the greatest impact across a range of outcomes. So making vaccines universally available, making micronutrient supplements available for pregnant and new mothers and so on. And also things like access to school and improving literacy. And these have been force multipliers for improved outcomes across a range of different indicators. I think with early childhood development and child protection, these are slightly newer fields globally. So I think what we're trying to do now is to harness the science to come up with answers to the question, what are the force multipliers? What are the accelerators for child protection and particularly for early childhood development? And I think primary prevention through parenting programs, improved perinatal care and family-friendly policies is a population-level public health approach to driving better developmental outcomes for children and for preventing harm and negative outcomes. And I think now we have that knowledge with the first generation in history that can really make a huge difference particularly to child protection outcomes.
So Ben, a lot of our listeners are involved in family support in disadvantaged communities. They would tend to be working with individual families, individual children. What you're describing are very large-scale, population-wide initiatives. How does any of that translate to local-level service delivery?
So when people think about the type of responses you're suggesting, they respond to the section of the population where the need is most visible, right? The child protection caseload, people in extreme poverty or affected by other forms of exclusion. But one of the things that we've learned over the past 20 to 30 years is that childhood adversity, poor attachment, neglect, violence, abuse affects more than half of the population. And so that's a population level problem. It's our greatest public health, it's our costliest and least discussed public health problem. So we need to have a public health approach to that that's population wide. But is relatively low cost. So we know that not the cost of inaction on things like adverse childhood experiences is at least 11% of GDP, probably much higher. But a parenting program that reaches everybody with a minimum package of support and then is progressively supporting those who need more help is a fraction of that cost. And the impacts can be huge. We know now from a World Health Organization-led systematic review, 435 randomized controlled trials, that parenting programs really work. prevention early has a huge impact across the population, saves lots of resources in terms of the public purse, you'll still need to have targeted interventions for really vulnerable people in very difficult situations. But parenting programs can be part of that targeted support as well.
So what you're suggesting there, Ben, is the need for that full continuum of provision from universal to targeted. And I think one of the things that lots of us here in Ireland are concerned about is the growing push to being much more targeted and the increasing thresholds that are being put in place in order to access targeted services. So it's becoming increasingly difficult to provide services on a universal basis. What kind of arguments do you think we can make to address that issue?
I think one of the reasons it's so hard is because we haven't yet absorbed as a society this science of what's happening with child development. You know, for example, people still don't really recognise that adverse childhood experiences are the greatest preventative cause of mental illness, contribute to substance misuse disorders and obesity and vulnerability to crime, violence and trafficking and poor health outcomes. So I think what we really need to do is land that argument and find a language with which to make it understood and actioned by policymakers. I think we need to, every society evolves as science evolves, and then our ability to translate scientific findings into policy outcomes to advance human progress takes time. And it takes adaptation of institutions that are used to dealing with things in a certain way based on the evidence that we had when those institutions were established. Education system is a great example of that. But we need to have the agility to be able to modernise institutions and services. And I think that if we could get institutions and the public and democratic institutions, the media and so on, to have a much greater understanding of how much it costs us not to do anything about child trauma and adversity and how we will benefit from a society if we invested in it. I think the difficulty in getting policymakers to commit to making universal services available would reduce.
It's quite a big if though, isn't it? Because getting any attention to prevention is very hard to do. People aren't really engaged in conversations about something that we can stop happening. They're much more, our attention is much more drawn to the difficulties that are in front of us.
I'm not sure, because COVID was an example. Everybody completely changed their entire lifestyle. And because of COVID, to prevent themselves getting COVID, or to prevent themselves from putting a strain on the health system. I think that in the past with vaccines, with nutrition, with education, with other things, I think people have been able to absorb knowledge about prevention and action it. I think we live in a very difficult time because of culture wars and this complexity of competing issues, competing groups, competing ideas, and trying to cut through that is a challenge. But if you go down to the main bookstore here in Limerick, what you'll see is whole shelves full of books about parenting, about mental health, about trauma and how do you deal with trauma, and there is a massive public interest in that. So this is an idea whose time has come, but it's one that we have to make easier and clearer for policymakers to champion.
In your book, Ben, Trauma Proof, you talk about, and obviously a lot of your experience has been about taking a population health approach. Can you explain what that means?
Yes, you've got a baseline. So in the vaccine, you say that, with 20% of the children are vaccinated, we want to get to 90% within the next 5 years. And that's the intervention. And then the outcome is that disease is reduced. So a public health approach would say we currently have 20% of the population receiving parenting programs. We want to make that 100% within a 5-year period. And we want to see the outcome reduction in harm, and the outcome improvement in terms of nurturing, learning, social, social, emotional skills. So public health approach means you take a baseline, a target, and you measure an outcome as a result, and it's for the entire population. And one of the great things about that for parenting programs is it removes the stigma. There's so much stigma around being, and I know this because I'm from a care background, if you're identified as somebody who's got, challenges at home, it carries a lot of stigma, there's issues of shame as well, chronic shame as well. I think that if you make them universally a norm, you get rid of all of that. And then you have more available for those that need it. In the same way that COVID response was a public health response. As many people have adverse child experiences as had COVID. And with COVID, you made sure everybody was aware of the problem. So you need to have a lot of awareness as well about what causes trauma, what causes adversity. You need to break through the myths. Then they made sure everybody was aware of the problem. Then they did what they could to prevent through vaccines, and they treated those who were infected and had worse consequences. So I think that's a public health approach.
They're quite startling statistics, aren't they? I mean, the same number of people who are affected by COVID as have ACEs, have adverse childhood experiences. I mean, do people always believe you when you make statements like that? Do you get that challenged?
Well, no, I'm not it's not off the cuff. It's based on, adverse child experiences, surveys across 37 countries, many at a population level. And so they show that on average, 57% of the population have one adverse childhood experience. It's 13%, 4 or more. And one adverse, often, I think one of the things that's a problem is that people think that when we talk about adverse child experiences, we're talking about intentional harm, and often we're not, because it's intergenerational. If somebody's grown up not feeling loved or safe at home, if the way their family got things done was by yelling and they found it hard to express love, you're very likely to automatically, unintentionally pass that on to your children if you haven't had a chance to think about it and process it, which parenting programs give you that chance. So we're talking about unintentional, intergenerational, automatic ACEs. Now, ACEs are not trauma. ACEs are risk factor for trauma. So somebody could experience a period of emotional neglect, but then because of a parental response or a family response which makes them feel connected and attached again, it will not become a lifelong trauma. In the same way that some people will get COVID and it doesn't mean they're going to end up in the intensive care unit, right? So that's the way you have to look at it, I think. That's where the correlation with, or the comparison with COVID comes from. It's recognizing we need to move all the judgment out of this conversation. We need to stop thinking in terms of black and white and right and wrong. This is a problem that we all share as a society, and we need to address it together as a society.
I suppose I'm thinking about the pre and during COVID, the growing movement of the anti-vaxxers, and it feels like we've got really polarised views about what's the appropriate way to behave, or what's the appropriate way to manage our services, or what is the right thing to do for people who are struggling. And I'm wondering, what's the kind of populist response to adverse childhood experiences? I mean, do they just deny that they happen, or that they are real, or what's that kind of view sound like?
I don't see, certainly some very high profile populist politicians. I'm not going to mention because I work for the UN, I'm a diplomat, but some very high profile, extremely high profile populist politicians have spoken about ACEs in their own life, have written about ACEs, and they acknowledge that it's an issue. It hasn't become a partisan thing. What you have to do if you're working on advocacy on this is to try to do everything you can to make sure that it doesn't come across as being partisan. So it has that cross-constituency appeal and understanding, but because it's people's lived experience, it can be easy to communicate if you do so sensitively. Like if you communicate that for example, on parenting programs and trauma, if you say that many of us lived with things like yelling or violence or children should be not seen and not heard, and then we realised the harm it did, in the same way we realised the harm that smoking did. So we realised that we had to address it as a society. It's not a big deal, we just have to address it because the science has now told us that, we can. And so we just want to do, we want to scale up parenting programs and a few other, sensible interventions to address the problem. And if a person is on the right, they might be drawn to the conversation because they like the economic arguments. Somebody on the left might be drawn to it because they like the human rights arguments. But what matters is the outcome, and the outcome is we can create a world in which every child is safe, seen, soothed, and secure. And so to me, it's just about the way you present it. People, obviously, any idea, people from particularly the far left or far right will try and colonize it and use it for other purposes, but we just need to hold it in the center as something that should be sanctified. And we also need to be extremely sensitive when we talk about these issues, because this idea of like culture wars type political debate where you try and get one over on the other person and stick it to them, you can't do that with trauma. It's too sensitive. You don't know who you're speaking to, you don't know what they've been through. So it just has to be a very sensitive, balanced, mature conversation.
Ben, one of the things that you do really eloquently in your book, Trauma Proof, is to talk about your own experience of trauma and how it took you some time to realise how that was impacting on your own behaviours and choices that you were making. Could you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I outwardly kind of successful. I had a master's degree, I was into sports, I had a UN career. I got to the peak of a UN career where you become a country representative, which is a kind of a diplomatic senior role, and I was doing very well. And then I went to a conference about deinstitutionalization, and I sat in the room and I gave my speech. The minister who I was accompanying gave his speech, and then we sat down in our suits and we listened to a lecture by somebody talking about how institutional care affects the emotional world of a child and how that stays with them through adulthood. And I was listening to this and I suddenly switched from being a human rights diplomat to being somebody that comes from a children's home. And I realized that he was talking about me, and I realized that I had what he would describe as an insecure attachment, an avoidant attachment style, kind of a James Bond kind of like attachment style where you avoid close connection and intimacy with other people. And I was living with that, though outwardly successful, nobody would know unless they really got to know me. And so I walked out of the meeting and I called a friend who had just been seeing a therapist and told me about this, and I called the therapist and I went on a huge healing journey. I spent a year regularly seeing a therapist. I took up mindfulness and I changed my life, and I didn't realize that a person could be so happy. My world went from black and white to color, and I began really trying to understand where my trauma had come from, and beginning to understand how normal it was that somebody from a children's home would struggle with their emotional world. And I went back to where I come from, and I hadn't done that my whole life. It took a lot of courage and convincing one therapist to go back to the places I'd been as a child. And I contacted somebody that had known my family, and she described a situation where all of them had some kind of trauma, the addiction, alcohol, crime, and that I was the one that went into a children's home, but it was prevalent throughout, and this was intergenerational, and I could see it. And that made me understand that it wasn't just people like me that were in that situation, that trauma is much more widespread and common and inextricably linked with all of the problems social problems like addiction and crime that you see around you.
And how did that discovery change how you work, how you view your work, what you believe makes a difference?
I tell a story in the book about holding my newborn son in my arms and my own childhood being unimaginable to me as I am now. and this being giving me a very strong feeling that the cycle had been broken. And so then I put that with my public health background of working on large-scale vaccination campaigns or education access campaigns. I worked in Afghanistan on a campaign many years prior that got millions of children into school for the first time. So I saw that you can have audacious impacts for change. So I looked at my own healing journey and looked at all of that professional experience, and I thought that if I can heal, cannot everybody heal, and can we not prevent this in the first place? And so I spent the next few years asking scientists, and this is in the book, asking scientists if they thought it was possible that we could end child maltreatment, and most think it is.
So what are the solutions then, Ben? What are the things we need to focus on, both in terms of helping people to heal, because a lot of us are working with families where there is intergenerational trauma, but also how can we prevent the next generation from continuing to carry that?
I think the answer in key is relationships, and we talk a lot about attachment. So I think attachment is the greatest social and economic asset we have, child-parental attachment. When it's in deficit, it's the greatest public health problem that we have, but we now know how to make sure that every child grows up safe and loved. And I think the investment in primary attachment through three things: good perinatal care that takes into account the parenting strategy and the attachment that the parent will have with the child and supports them in that; good family-friendly policies that give enough time off work and a chance to bond and support parents in general. And thirdly, and most revolutionary, evidence-based parenting programs, making them universally available and progressive for people that need more. Secondary attachment through making sure that schools promote relationships and that children are secure, safe, seen and soothed in schools. There's a very funny, very old British journalist called Melvyn Bragg, and he did an interview recently, and he said that he'd interviewed hundreds and hundreds of highly successful people, and the ones from disadvantaged backgrounds have always said there was this teacher. The importance of teacher relationships is important for every kid's learning, but it's really important for kids that are deprived of attachment. Children who are loved at home come to school to learn. Children that are not loved at home, don't feel loved at home, come to school to be loved. And they express it in the most difficult of ways, most challenging of ways. So I think teaching relationships in school is really important. That's secondary attachment. And then the tertiary attachment really is about that healing and making sure that services are available for child protection, for children on child protection registers, children that come to the attention of the authorities where the damage in many ways has already been done, but ensuring that they can access support through really well-funded social work and psychosocial services that promote relationships. Most people don't heal, I think, through services. They heal through relationships. So if you just promote relationships, often that can be enough. Especially when I work with countries, I like African countries. In Africa, you've got one mental health professional per 100,000 people. So a lot of the projects, like there's one called the Friendship Bench that is very popular in South Africa and Zimbabwe, they just focus on giving people someone to talk to and someone to have a connection with. And it has great outcomes.
So the relationship is the intervention?
The relationship is the intervention, yeah.
Ben, you participated in and spoke at the Penn 2025 summit, so you got to hear a little bit about some of the work that's happening here in Ireland. Any reflections from that?
Yeah, I think that you're in a really exciting moment, because I think you might be just about to have some kind of prevention national strategy. I heard that Dickie Bird told me that, so I think that's really exciting. You've got such brilliant ideas, such a great community that brings together the thought leadership and the service delivery. Like, it's really sobering for people like me who are doing thought leadership and advocacy to communicate with service deliverers. I heard so much this morning that was influential. Martin Luther King had this idea of a beloved community, which was where a mutually respectful community of actors comes together to drive positive change. And this, in a way, is a beloved community in the way that he would describe it. And I think you should be extremely proud to be part of that. And I'll be watching from New York, as you go forward. I think you're also part of a global network. I'm doing similar talks these days in Kazakhstan, in Australia, in Portugal, and there is a growing, some of these countries are considering rolling out similar strategies. So we're at a moment in history, and I think that Ireland is one of the countries leading the way, and it's because of the work of your network.
Well, Ben, I'm sure everybody from the Prevention and Early Intervention Network is looking forward to going on that journey with you and working together to progress the work. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Yvonne Galvin. I'm co-CEO of Our Lady of Lourdes, and we're leaving the summit today feeling very energised. But for us, the golden hour of the summit was definitely the Children's Court. It really brought lived experience and lessons to adults that handed over to the experts.
Hi, I'm Matt Battery. I'm the Chief Executive of Triple P UK and Ireland. I'm also the Chair of the All Ireland Parenting Network. Thoroughly enjoyed the conference. I have to say though, I'm worried that we are preaching to the choir in the room, and that many of the people here are already on board with the message. And what I'd love to see and help us think about going forward is how do we get a wider constituency of policymakers, of politicians, who perhaps haven't heard the messages that we've been talking about so powerfully at this conference today. But it has been a really phenomenal conference. I think the way in which it's been hosted has just been so sensitive, so thoughtful, that there's been that real mix of kind of cerebral, head-challenging stuff, but also real heart challenging stuff too. And I think we are left with that message at the end of the day. There is hope, and we can do more to prevent and intervene early in Ireland.
Brilliant.
My name is Keith Cunnisky. I work for Focus Ireland. I work with youth and young care leaders. I think it's been a fantastic 2 days. Lots to think about. Really some fascinating speakers. Great to see everybody, knowing that there are so many people in the sector all on the same page, and it was great hearing from the kids' perspectives. And one of the things I found that really struck me was the amount of times the word love was used. That was fantastic. I think in the way the state of the world is at the moment, we need to hear a bit more of that. So that was super.
Great.
Lovely.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Amy Mulvihill. I'm the National Manager for Prevention, Partnership and Family Sport. And for me, the best thing about the event was seeing the collective enthusiasm for prevention and early intervention, and also reminding us who work in corporate offices of why we're doing this and the impact it makes for families.
My name is Karen Costello. I'm a Senior Psychologist with Archways, and I work on the Changing Lives Fire to Thrive programme. One thing I'm taking away from the conference is just the energy that everybody has to do better, to listen more, and to really make a difference, and continuing to make a difference in the lives of people that they're working with.
Hello, Imelda Graham here. The conference this time for Penn was very refreshing. It had a lot to do with children. It had a lot to do with love, and the whole idea that children need a champion and children need to be loved in the word go. And that message needs to be in all our strategy. It needs to be in all our interactions with government and with policy guidance and advice.
My name's Kevin Webster. I'm a PPFS manager at Tussa, and my big takeaway was actually when Caroline McGregor was speaking yesterday about the mother and baby institutions, and she talked about home. I never thought of how that word was being used to kind of soften and kind of take away the sense that they were horrible places, but it kind of made them seem like we were providing something that was a home, and it wasn't. I never ever thought about that before, and it kind of makes you think about how powerful language is and how it can unconsciously affect how you think about things. And then when you get that light bulb moment, it changes completely how you think about something.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Benjamin Perks. I certainly did, and I could recommend the Trauma-Proof Healing, Attachment and the Science of Prevention, in which Benjamin shares a lot more of his journey than we had the opportunity to talk about. And it really brings to life a very comprehensive theoretical framework on how we can all promote attachment. Thanks for listening to Perspectives on Prevention. We hope you stay tuned.